Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Jennifer Taddick. I'm the Vice President of Communications and Engagement here at the Alliance for the Great Lakes, and I will be moderating today's discussion. I'm joined here in our Chicago office by Alliance for the Great Lakes CEO and President Joel Bremeier and our Vice President for Policy, Molly Flanagan. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping items. First of all, we are thrilled to have over 500 people registered for today's event. As a result, all attendees will be on mute for the duration of the webinar to reduce background noise. We will leave plenty of time for questions. You will be able to enter questions at any time using the question screen, as you can see here to the right, and you can enter questions at any time or at the end when we open it up for questions, and I will be moderating those questions. Additionally, we are recording today's webinar, and we will make the recording available on our website after today's event later in the afternoon. With all of that, I will turn things over to Joel Bremeier, Alliance for the Great Lakes President and CEO. Joel?
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for taking some time out of your day to join us. We really appreciate that. As Jen said, I'm Joel Bremeier. I'm the President and CEO of the Alliance for the Great Lakes, and I'm here today with Molly to talk with you about one of the types of work that the Alliance for the Great Lakes does, and that is to advance what we think are important federal policy priorities to protect and restore the Great Lakes. We're not going to talk about every Great Lakes issue today. I want to be clear about that up front. This is really about the role of federal policy and some of the work that Congress can do to take care of the Great Lakes. Certainly there's a lot of great work that is happening and needs to happen at the state and local level as well. So I know there's been a great deal of concern and skepticism over the role of government in people's lives over the last year, and I think it's important to recognize why federal policy is important to the Great Lakes. Just a few basics. First of all, federal policy really sets the floor for what other units of government like states and cities have to do to protect clean water and the lakes. States and cities can always choose to do more, but our federal government sets policies and standards that ensure that our Great Lakes enjoy a basic level of protection. And making sure that that floor stays in place and is strong and has good integrity is really critical. Another reason that we think federal policy is important is that our federal government provides leadership, expertise, and regulation on matters that cross state and even international boundaries. And of course, many of you on the phone, if not all of you, are well aware that the Great Lakes do not stop at state and national borders. In fact, they cross those regularly, and we depend on the federal government to provide leadership on ensuring that the Great Lakes stay protected, even when that job falls to more than one state or province or country. And finally, more than 40 million people across the U.S. and Canada, and more than 30 million people just in the U.S. alone, are residents of the Great Lakes Basin and drink Great Lakes water. We believe that our clean water values can unify us, and you, as a resident of this country, have the opportunity to tell your decision makers that your expectation is that our water is kept clean and safe. And so we're here today to talk about some ways that you can do that and to answer your questions about priorities that you may have. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Molly Flanagan, the Alliance for the Great Lakes Vice President for Policy.
Thanks, Joel. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining this webinar. You may recognize my name because you probably got emails about this webinar from me. So thanks for being on. Your voice is really critical. And an important part of the work that we do here at the Alliance for the Great Lakes is engaging people like you in helping to carry our message and your message to members of Congress. So one of the reasons that we set federal priorities is to tell the administration and members of Congress what we expect out of Great Lakes champions. And it gives us a platform to engage those offices on when we go to D.C. In fact, I'm going to be in Washington, D.C. next week talking to congressional offices about our federal priorities. And it's great to have constituents like you weighing in to support the messages that I'm bringing to those offices. And we're not doing this work alone. We work closely with a broad network of partners and allies to advocate for strong policy and funding to protect and restore the Great Lakes. One of those allies is the Healing Our Waters Coalition. And we're pleased to work with the Healing Our Waters Coalition to advocate for some of our shared priorities. And in fact, we're going to be back in DC in March, lobbying with the Healing Our Waters Coalition on a number of our federal priorities and our shared priorities. One of our top priorities for this year is full funding for the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. We want Congress to fund it at least $300 million a year. These funds are used in communities across the Great Lakes region to address a number of the other federal priorities that I'm going to talk to you about. Great Lakes Restoration Initiative funds help to clean up toxic hotspots around the region. They prevent the introduction of new aquatic invasive species into the Great Lakes and curtail the spread of those species around the Great Lakes. They reduce agricultural pollution that contributes to harmful algal blooms in places like Lake Erie, Green Bay, and Saginaw Bay. And those funds restore habitat to protect native species in the Great Lakes. These projects are good for the environment, and they're also really good for communities. They create jobs and improve recreational opportunities like swimming, boating, and fishing. A Brookings Institution report showed that for every dollar invested in Great Lakes restoration, the region sees $2 in return in the form of increased fishing, tourism, and home values. Luckily, our Great Lakes delegation has been united in supporting this program, and we expect that they'll continue to fight for this program, and we'll support them in that. However, this is one of the few areas where there's nearly unanimous support from Congress. And we're going to need more members of Congress from our region to support some other things that are more controversial and heavier lifts. So we're also calling on Congress to maintain funding for the Environmental Protection Agency. In particular, we want to see support for EPA's Great Lakes program, which plays a critical role in protecting our region's air and water. And we're asking Congress to uphold the Clean Water Act to ensure that progress in restoring the Great Lakes isn't undermined by weakening bedrock laws that protect clean water. And again, we're not alone in fighting these cuts. We'll push back on cuts to the GLRI and other programs that impact the Great Lakes as part of the Healing Our Waters Coalition and with many, many partners across the region. The next thing I want to talk to you about is aquatic invasive species. And aquatic invasive species like zebra and quagga mussels, round goby, and sea lamprey have caused irreparable damage to the Great Lakes. Not only that, these species cause more than $200 million in economic damages to communities across the region annually. And once a new aquatic invasive species gets into the Great Lakes, it's practically impossible to get it out. So that's why the Alliance is focused on preventing new invasion. And our federal agenda includes two critical issues to achieve this. First, we want to make sure that ships entering the Great Lakes from other parts of the world aren't bringing new invasive species with them into the Great Lakes. This can and has definitely happened over and over again when ships dump their ballast water in Great Lakes ports. Ballast water is what ships use to stabilize themselves when they're loading and unloading cargo. And when they discharge water, they're discharging anything else that's in those tanks, and so that often includes living organisms. Currently, this biological pollution is regulated under the Clean Water Act by EPA, and we want to make sure it stays that way. But the regulated shipping industry doesn't, and they're relentlessly working to chip away our support in Congress for these regulations. No polluter should get the type of special treatment that they're asking for, and I think we can agree that the Great Lakes are too important and have already suffered too much damage from invasive species to risk any additional invasions. Therefore, the Alliance for the Great Lakes opposes efforts to weaken ballast water standards, including a particular bill called the Vessel Incidental Discharge Act. And we need you to join us in opposing S-168 in the Senate and H.R. 1154 in the House, and any efforts by Congress to attach these bills to other pieces of legislation that might be moving. Another huge invasive species threat in the Great Lakes is Asian carp, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with Asian carp. These are the fish that fly through the air and injure boaters. They also eat the food that a lot of other Great Lakes fish rely on. And they threaten the regional economy, especially our multi-billion-dollar recreation, boating, and tourism sectors. Last summer, an Asian carp was found just 9 miles from Lake Michigan in the Chicago waterways. The fish originated below the electric barriers, which you can see on the map on the screen. And these barriers are the last line of defense keeping Asian carp out of Lake Michigan. With your help, we sent a clear message to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers that we need new protections to keep Asian carp out of the Great Lakes. Thousands of people like you, and probably many of you on the phone, demanded swift action to put structural protections into place at Brandon Road Lock and Dam. You can also see that on the screen. It's about 47 miles from Lake Michigan. And what we want to do is make sure that Asian carp don't get past that point. And so the Alliance wants the Great Lakes Congressional Delegation to ensure that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers completes its Brandon Road study on schedule by January 2019, if not sooner. And we also want Congress to authorize full federal funding for construction of structural protections at Brandon Road to prevent Asian carp from moving closer to Lake Michigan. And now I'm going to move on to water infrastructure. The American Society of Civil Engineers gives our wastewater system nationally a D+, and our drinking water system a D. This is simply unacceptable. If you have children, my guess is if they bring home a report card with a D or a D+, you're pretty angry, and we should be angry, as a region. The nation's wastewater and stormwater systems need an estimated $271 billion. That's with a B, billion dollars in capital investments over the next 25 years. Failing wastewater infrastructure results in combined sewer overflows that pollute the Great Lakes with sewage and closed beaches. It also results in community flooding and basement backups of sewage into homes. The Clean Water State Revolving Fund is a federal funding source that offers communities low-cost financing to pay for water infrastructure projects. And so at the Alliance, we're supporting tripling the amount of funding available for the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. This is consistent with what President Trump asked for during his campaign. And we want to make sure that some of this funding is set aside as grants for low-income communities. On the drinking water side, according to the American Water Works Association, we need an estimated $1 trillion to repair, replace, and expand drinking water systems all over the next 25 years. To address these drinking water infrastructure needs, again, we're going to need a lot more money going to address this. And so the Alliance once again supports tripling the amount of funding available for the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. And again, we want some of these funds set aside as grants for low-income communities to address their drinking water infrastructure needs. We also support establishing a federal low-income water and sewer assistance program to help low-income households afford their water and sewer. People in the Great Lakes region shouldn't lose access to drinking water because they can't afford it. A program like this already exists to help low-income households with their energy bills, and we want one to be established for water and sewer bills. We support H.R. 2328, the Low-Income Sewer and Water Assistance Program, which has been introduced in the House. And now I'm going to move on to toxic algal blooms. And you can see from the picture on the screen, this is a photo from Western Lake Erie, where pollution from farms is helping to fuel massive harmful algal blooms in Western Lake Erie and in other parts of the Great Lakes region. These blooms, unfortunately, have become an annual occurrence. In 2014, a toxic bloom in Lake Erie left 500,000 people without access to safe drinking water for days. These harmful algal blooms pose a significant threat to the region's drinking water, quality of life, and economic well-being. So what can we do about it? The Alliance supports more funding for Farm Bill programs that help farmers reduce pollution flowing into the Great Lakes. And we also support clear, measurable, and accountable plans by the states of Ohio, Michigan, and Indiana, and the province of Ontario. These are the jurisdictions that are contributing pollution to Western Lake Erie, and they've committed to a 40% reduction in phosphorus that's driving these harmful algal blooms, and to achieving that goal by 2025. A 40% reduction in phosphorus would substantially reduce toxic algal blooms in Lake Erie. And US EPA also has a really important role to play in ensuring that a strong plan exists and that the states are accountable for implementing it and ultimately for cleaning up Lake Erie. Finally, I want to turn to plastic pollution in the Great Lakes. In 2015, we saw a big win when the Microbeads-Free Waters Act became law in the United States. The law banned plastic microbeads in rinse-off cosmetics. Plastic microbeads, however, are only a small part of the problem. The majority of plastics in the Great Lakes are actually fragments that are broken down from larger pieces of plastics like bottles or bags, while a lot of the small plastic that's found in rivers that flow into the Great Lakes are actually fibers from synthetic fabrics. Microplastics have even been found in treated drinking water. It's a complex problem, and it's going to require a number of solutions. But there is a piece of legislation introduced in Congress that the Alliance supports called the Save Our Seas Act of 2017. It's passed in the Senate, and it's been introduced in the House as H.R. 2748. It reauthorizes a program from under the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration called the Marine Debris Program. And it would provide authorization for 5 years of funding at $10 million per year. An important thing that this program does is focus on reducing marine debris, including plastics, and stopping them from getting into the Great Lakes. So that's a summary of our federal priorities for 2018. And now I'd like to turn it back over to Joel.
Thank you, Molly. So there's no denying that 2017 was a challenging year. We saw a push from the White House level to zero out funding programs for the Great Lakes. We saw a pullback on invasive species protections, and we saw a lot of concern nationally over the direction of environmental policy that affects the Great Lakes and waters all across the country. I'm optimistic going into 2018 because I saw the pushback that came from the Great Lakes region when those proposals hit the press. And we saw that because of strong support from people like yourselves across the region and with bipartisan pushback from Congress, we made it very clear to the federal government how important the Great Lakes are to each of us and to the region. We believe that that kind of potential and that kind of strength from our region is what's really necessary to show that we need these programs in place, and we need to keep adding protections for the Great Lakes, not rolling them back. There are a couple of opportunities that we want you to know about coming up in 2018, and then we'll move on to our question and answer period. One is a reminder that this is, of course, a midterm election year, and we have in the Great Lakes region 8 Senate seats and 7 governor's seats that are up for election during 2018. Now, our Great Lakes senators and our Great Lakes governors have historically played a vital role in creating leadership for Great Lakes protection and restoration. And it's going to be important to ensure that those conversations about the importance of clean water in the Great Lakes are happening as our candidates for elected office debate with each other and answer questions from the public as this year goes forward. So we'll look forward to talking more about that with you in the future. Right now, we're going to be asking you to join us in completing an action alert and telling your member of Congress and your senators that you also support these Great Lakes federal priorities, and you'll be receiving follow-up information after this webinar to do just that. You can also go directly to the URL that's on your screen right now. And as a reminder, we're grateful to Molly for making her way out to Washington next week. It would be great if you could let your decision makers know this week that you support these priorities, because your voice is what can add to the voice of people like Molly and others that we work with, and ensure that our elected officials know how important these priorities are. So with that, I'm going to turn things back over to Jennifer Caddick and move on to our Q&A period.
Great. Thanks so much, Joel and Molly. We already have some questions pouring in, so we'll start to tackle those. For those of you that have questions for either Joel or Molly, you can enter them in the little questions box as illustrated here on your screen. So I'll start off with one question perhaps for you, Molly. Someone has asked that you mentioned the Healing Our Waters Coalition is one of the Alliance's policy partners, and they're asking for information on some of the other partners with whom we are working. So I'm curious if you could elaborate a little bit on that.
Absolutely, and I mentioned Healing Our Waters because it's a coalition that includes a number of the other organizations that we work with across the region. And of course, it's always dangerous to start down a list of naming organizations because you're going to leave some out. But we do have, I talked a lot about work on reducing harmful algal blooms, and we're doing a lot of work with organizations in Michigan and Ohio The National Wildlife Federation has a Great Lakes office that's active in those issues. And most of the states have statewide environmental organizations. So we've been doing a lot of work with the Ohio Environmental Council in Ohio and with Michigan Environmental Council and the Michigan League of Conservation Voters in Michigan. Some of our other regional partners, I already mentioned National Wildlife Federation, but Freshwater Future does some great work around the region, organizing community organizations and making sure that their voices are heard in these policy debates that are happening at the state and federal level. So we really are reliant on partners all across the region to help be advocates for these important issues, both at the local level, the state level, and at the federal level.
Thanks, Molly. That's great. I have a couple of requests for bill numbers. Molly did mention a few very specific pieces of legislation that we are supporting. Rather than inundate you with a whole bunch of numbers right now, I just do want to let everyone know that the full federal priorities list will be posted on our website later this afternoon, so you'll be able to find all of that information on our website. So keep an eye out for an email later today from us with all of that information. I have a question here about the ratings that you mentioned, Molly, from the Association of Civil Engineers. And the question is asking if that is just for the Great Lakes region or if it is nationally.
That is a national rating system. So they're looking at wastewater and drinking water infrastructure across the nation. I will, however, note that in terms of water infrastructure, the Great Lakes region has some of the oldest infrastructure in the nation. And so while that grade is a national grade, we know that there's a lot of investment that's needed here in the Great Lakes region. We have combined sewer overflows almost every time it rains. And that pollution, that sewage pollution into the Great Lakes contaminates beaches and makes it unsafe to swim. So a lot of water infrastructure challenges here in the Great Lakes region.
We have a question, which I think is a great one, about asking about the role of Great Lakes mayors and the idea of some bottom-up advocacy versus the top-down from Congress. Joel, do you want to answer that question?
I'm happy to. Yes, that's a good question. There's actually an organization called the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence River Cities Initiative that is a coalition of mayors from across the U.S. and Canada who are in the Great Lakes watershed. We strongly support the role of mayors and their cities in advocating for the Great Lakes because the mayors and the people who live in cities who work with mayors are often the ones who see the net result of federal policy firsthand, whether it's in crumbling infrastructure or in unsafe drinking water or in the positive side of what restoration can do for a community. They're also key decision makers. The choices that mayors make can make things happen in communities quickly, and they can happen to the benefit of people in a way that is closer to the ground and more tangible sometimes than our federal decision makers. So it's really critical to have municipal leaders and residents of those cities working together to advance a policy agenda as well.
Thanks, Joel. I have a question here asking specifically about President Trump's proposed infrastructure legislation, which I don't believe has been released yet. The question is, will Great Lakes water infrastructure needs specifically be included in that proposal? And I don't know if we know the answer to that question and have any information on when that might be released.
So the question of the infrastructure proposal for which we know the broad outlines, and there's been some information that has been released, not specific to the Great Lakes, but certainly known that there is a desire to make that, to propose a combination of public and private money going to infrastructure, and certainly a push to roll back environmental regulations. You might hear the word streamlining being used to describe that. Unfortunately, I think that's an overly optimistic euphemism for undoing protections to make development proceed more quickly with less oversight. The bottom line on the role of the federal government in water infrastructure is this. There is a clear and massive unmet financial need for communities around the Great Lakes region. There is a clear need for some communities that are lower income and have less wealth to have their needs addressed in a different way than others, and they need more support. And there's an incredible opportunity in front of Congress to rethink how we are driving infrastructure dollars to the Great Lakes region right now in some of the ways that Molly described. So right now, what we're seeing from the leaked or the pre versions of the Trump infrastructure plan doesn't, it appears to put the environment at risk based on some of the streamlining efforts that we're seeing proposed, and we're not seeing how those dollars are actually going to flow to some of the communities that need it most. So we'll wait and see, but that's where things stand right now.
Thanks, Joel. I have a question here asking about the political races for office coming up this year. The question is, you mentioned political races for Senate and governor, and what are your concerns about House races as well? I do believe all of the members of the House of Representatives are up for election this year.
Yeah, so not only do we have 8 Senate races and 7 governor's races here in the Great Lakes region, but as Jen just mentioned, all members of the U.S. House of Representatives are up for election this year. And I think, the thing to keep in mind about the Great Lakes is that in many cases, they're a bipartisan issue. And so we have Republicans and Democrats and independents who come together to support issues related to the Great Lakes. And so this isn't an issue about party or about partisan politics, but one of the things that we want to do at the Alliance for the Great Lakes, and where we can use your help, is getting as many candidates as possible on the record supporting Great Lakes issues. And so, again, it doesn't matter what party a person is part of. They can still be supportive of Great Lakes protection and restoration. And there's a role for people across the region to play in talking to candidates about the importance of the Great Lakes and getting them to commit to Great Lakes protection and restoration.
Thanks, Molly. Sorry, we have lots of questions rolling in here. We have a number of questions, which probably a whole bunch of them about Line 5 and the possible impact of that on the Great Lakes and the Alliance's position on that. And so, Joel, do you want to tackle that question?
Sure, I'm happy to. And as I said at the top of the call today, we weren't going to present on every Great Lakes issue, only the ones where we think there's a really critical federal role that you can also play a role in. Line 5 is, I think probably everybody on this call knows, is the pipeline running under the Straits of Mackinac in Michigan, and the flat out the position that we've taken, as many others have, is that line should be decommissioned, and we also want to make sure that pipeline is any alternatives to that pipeline do not put either the Great Lakes or communities of people around the Great Lakes at additional risk as a result of oil transport. I want to draw your attention. There is a strong coalition in Michigan that is working every day on this issue, called the Oil and Water Don't Mix Coalition. Very easy to find online, and I encourage you to check that out because they have really taken a leadership role in driving toward the elimination of that pipeline and that risk to the Great Lakes.
Thanks, Joel. I have a question about the toxic algae pollution issues in Lake Erie. And the person is asking if the 2018 plans include efforts to make the current voluntary nutrient load reduction efforts or the voluntary pollution reduction efforts mandatory in Ohio, Michigan, and Indiana.
Jim, thanks for the question. This is a question from Toledo Rotary. Toledo Rotary has been a big leader in efforts to clean up Lake Erie. So thanks for being on the call and thanks for your question. Definitely part of what needs to happen is that the states need to be held accountable for actually achieving the 40% reduction goal that they've set in terms of reducing phosphorus flowing into Lake Erie. And so absolutely a part of our plan is working with the states, working with the federal government, and trying to find ways to continue to hold the states accountable for achieving those goals. One of the ways in which to do that is to use some of the protections under the Clean Water Act. And there is a way, the state of Michigan has actually already designated the open waters of Western Lake Erie as impaired under the Clean Water Act. We'd like to see the state of Ohio follow suit and do the same thing. We've been pressuring the state of Ohio for years and US EPA for years to make sure that Lake Erie gets that designation, because that would sort of set in place a series of actions that would result in a plan that would have some accountability built in. And so definitely, I can't say accountability enough. You know, voluntary measures are important, but clearly they haven't been enough to clean up Lake Erie. And so getting some mandatory changes and some accountability put into actually achieving those goals and cleaning up Lake Erie is critical. And, you know, we'll be wanting to rely on organizations in Ohio and Michigan and groups like Toledo Rotary to help carry those messages to decision makers at the local, state, and federal levels.
Thanks, Molly. I have a question here about asking for ways to get involved, asking, are there volunteer or other opportunities available for citizens to become involved locally to advance this agenda? Joel, do you want to tackle that question?
I'm happy to. So there's a few ways that you can get involved. One, I want to remind everybody on this call, you probably have a local organization doing great water work in your community, and I always encourage people to seek those out and to figure out what you can do locally to help your water locally. So that's one thing you can do. With the Alliance, you can certainly join us as a volunteer. One way is as a volunteer advocate through the action opportunities that you're going to see after this webinar. There's also opportunities to work with our Alliance Ambassadors program, which is a program we use to train people who want to learn more about the Great Lakes and find ways to take action to support the Great Lakes protection in their own way. It's a little more of an intensive training opportunity. And you can certainly volunteer as a member of our Adopt a Beach program, which is our regional cleanup program around the Great Lakes. That's also a great way to get to know the issues. And you'll get more information about all these opportunities after the call today.
Thanks, Joel. A quick link for those of you who are looking for all of those volunteer opportunities, visit our website, which is greatlakes.org, and click on Get Involved, and you'll find all those opportunities right there. Thanks, Joel. A specific question going back to the question about mayors in Great Lakes and Great Lakes cities. What is the best way to approach a mayor in a Great Lakes city to join the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Cities Initiative? Molly? Joel, any thoughts?
I'm happy to take that one. Yeah, this is a good question because I think it's critical to have that local leadership on Great Lakes issues, and certainly building the coalition of mayors that are interested in those issues is critical. You know, one is that I think drawing the connections between what our federal government has been able to provide to the Great Lakes region and what cities have been able to accomplish as a result is really critical. When I speak to mayors, what I think is most compelling are those real stories of how a collaboration between the federal government and mayors and other sectors has actually resulted in real restoration wins on the ground. So that could be the stories about how infrastructure was built, how open spaces were protected and restored, how people were protected because their drinking water infrastructure was replaced. Those kinds of stories and examples are really what compel mayors to think about how their communities could benefit from being involved in a Great Lakes coalition. And so there are great sources of stories out there. I'll point, Molly mentioned this in her comments, but I think that the Healing Our Waters Coalition has done a great job of helping to organize a group of success stories about how some Great Lakes restoration funds have been spent on the ground. There are lots of other examples out there. We've got some great examples from cities around the Great Lakes where we've driven water infrastructure investment. But mayors want to solve problems, and the more stories you can tell about how Great Lakes policy helps solve local problems, the more compelling that case will be.
Great. Thanks, Joel. I have a next question, which is actually about the Illinois governor's race. And the question is, if you had one message for the candidates for the Illinois governor, which is an open seat, what would it be?
It would be that the state of Illinois needs to be a leader on Great Lakes issues. And one of the ways that it can be a leader is in championing additional protections to keep Asian carp out of the Great Lakes. Unfortunately, we have a situation where our current administration in the state of Illinois is actually getting in the way of protections to keep Asian carp out of the Great Lakes. Just last week, We saw the states of Michigan, Ohio, and Wisconsin join with the province of Ontario in actually being willing to put some of their own money on the table to help make a plan at Brandon Road, Lock and Dam happen, to put additional protections in place to keep Asian carp out of the Great Lakes. The state of Illinois, on the other hand, has been blocking efforts to try to get these additional protections in place. And so what I would tell both our current governor and candidates for governor is that, the Great Lakes are critical to our community. Lake Michigan is really important to the city of Chicago. The Chicago waterways are really important to communities all throughout northern Illinois. And so any leader in the state of Illinois needs to be a leader in solving the Asian carp problem and not a laggard in trying to prevent things from happening.
That's great. Thanks, Molly. The next question I have is actually about, that I'll give to you, Joel, I think is about the role of Canada. How much influence or pressure on recent federal rollbacks in the U.S. on regulations and policy does Canada have, given particularly the role of the International Joint Commission and some related treaties between the two countries?
So, as I mentioned in my comments at the beginning today, this is, of course, an international watershed, and we have another country, the country of Canada, that plays a vital role, just like the United States does, in protecting and restoring the Great Lakes. In my conversations with Canadian and provincial leaders over the last year, when asked a question like this, what I've stressed is the importance, especially right now, of Canadian leaders leading by example and making it clear that the Great Lakes are a top priority for the provinces and for Canada, regardless of what's going on in the United States. And we've seen some evidence of that recently. Canada just made a significant new funding commitment to invasive species, to Asian carp prevention last month. We're seeing a drive by some nonprofit organizations in Canada to actually push for a Great Lakes Restoration Initiative-like program to be launched there, and some members of Congress have actually supported that approach. So I think that there are, one of the best things that Canada can do right now is lead by example and make it really clear that rollbacks of Great Lakes protections are the wrong direction, and make that known to their colleagues in the United States. The International Joint Commission, as you raised, also plays a role in Great Lakes protection, and especially on the ensuring the integrity of the science around how we plan for the future of the Great Lakes and for accountability of whether our plans that we set out are actually being achieved. One vital role that the IJC plays is in managing water levels on Lake Ontario, and that's an area that has been somewhat controversial over the last year due to some weather-induced flooding that occurred in 2017 and actually damaged people's property. The IJC, though, has played a vital role as an objective scientific voice of accountability for achieving Great Lakes goals, and it's really critical that they're supported to continue playing that role.
Thanks, Joel. The next question, I think, is for Molly. This questioner asks, if the Alliance for the Great Lakes is approaching candidates for office with our priorities that we've laid out today, and asking if there's a kit of some kind we have, or if we're going to be creating one to educate candidates. So I think we're working on something like that, Molly.
We absolutely are. Thanks so much for teeing that up. So the Alliance for the Great Lakes is going to be is teeing up a voter toolkit so that people like you who are interested in Great Lakes issues and interested in being involved in local, state, federal election races can actually take our toolkit and find questions that you can ask at candidates forums or submit to candidates to find out what their positions are on a number of Great Lakes issues. So if you care about funding to the Great Lakes, if you care about keeping Asian carp and other invasive species out of the Great Lakes, if you care about making sure we're not dumping sewage into the Great Lakes and that all people in the Great Lakes region have access to clean, safe, and affordable drinking water, we'll have a toolkit that you can use to ask candidates questions and try to get them on the record or better understand their views on these critical issues.
Thanks, Molly. The next question is asking about EPA, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's leader, Scott Pruett, who has made a number of claims about climate change and whether or not it is actually happening. The question is asking, what does this say, his position on climate change, what does this say about the chances of getting the federal government to invest in preparing the Great Lakes for the negative impact of climate change? And Joel, maybe I'll hand that over to you, and I know we're also doing a lot of local work as well.
Yeah, and this is, going back to the earlier questions about cities and mayors, the people who really see the impacts of climate change are the Great Lakes. On the Great Lakes are the residents of Great Lakes, cities and towns, and some of the decision makers, the local elected officials who have to deal with those consequences. That shows itself in things like massive flooding that hits city streets, sewer backups that damage people's properties and threaten people's health. And in a bigger way, we of course see it in the increased evaporation and reduced ice cover on the Great Lakes on average over time. So it's extremely concerning when you hear a federal leader who is supposed to be leading the agency that is intended to ensure that we protect the Great Lakes with full scientific rigor and objective, transparent thought about environmental impacts of climate change, questions whether or not that's actually a good or a bad thing. I think we have people across the Great Lakes who see the negative consequences of climate change right now and can tell you exactly what's going on. This is another reason that cities and communities around the region desperately need to invest in water infrastructure that can make their communities more resilient, that can protect the health of the people who live there, because the challenges are only going to get worse over the next century as the Great Lakes are already feeling the impacts of a changing climate.
Thanks, Joel. I do just want to chime in here. We have a couple of people saying that they arrived a little bit late and are asking if the slide deck will be available. Just to remind everyone, later this afternoon we'll be posting a recording of this webinar on our website, and we'll also be sharing that out with all of you later today via email. So keep your eyes peeled for that. I have a question about the Farm Bill, actually, which could potentially play into the Lake Erie issue and the problem of runoff pollution off of agricultural lands. And the questioner is asking, what specific changes to the Farm Bill in 2018 is the Alliance advocating for? And I do believe we have a specific item in our priorities.
We do. So the Farm Bill, Congress is actually working on a new Farm Bill right now. What they say is that they're actually going to be able to roll that out this spring, so we might be seeing that very, very soon. The Farm Bill plays an important role in pumping lots and lots of money into efforts that farmers undertake to reduce pollution, improve soil health, do all kinds of good things on their own land. And what the Alliance is asking for in this new Farm Bill is increased funding for the conservation title and giving higher priority to funding projects and practices that actually reduce water pollution from farming operations. So Farm Bill conservation dollars go to support a lot of different things on farmland, and a lot of those things obviously are very important. But we really want to see an emphasis on reducing water pollution, and we want funds for conservation programs that are intended to reduce water pollution to be awarded based on their clean water performance. So right now, a lot of funding under the Farm Bill is doled out first come, first serve. So a farmer that wants to implement practices on their land, if they're the first one in line, they get the money, even if reducing pollution from their land isn't the highest priority, won't make the biggest difference to Lake Erie or Green Bay or Saginaw Bay. And so what we'd like to see is more emphasis given to funding projects on farmland that will get the highest bang for the buck in terms of reducing water pollution, so that we can go further in addressing harmful algal blooms in places like Lake Erie.
Thanks, Molly. I'll condense a couple of questions into one here. We have a number of questions about plastic pollution. Obviously, we noted the big win over the past couple of years of having microbeads be phased out of personal care products, which was certainly an important step forward in keeping plastic pollution out of the Great Lakes and all of our world's waters. So there are a lot of questions here about what are some other sources of plastic pollution and what is the Alliance doing about that issue. Joel, could you tackle this one?
Sure. It's no surprise to anybody who walks down a city street or walks along the Great Lakes shoreline or a lake or river near you that you'll see plastic everywhere. And if you don't see it right away, if you kneel down and start using your hands to dig in the stones and dirt a bit, you'll find some immediately. Plastic is a pervasive problem in the Great Lakes region, and we got a wake-up call on this a few years ago when some great research coming out of New York started to show exactly what the concentrations of plastics were in the Great Lakes, and that focus on microbeads led to a federal ban on the manufacture and sale of those, which also spread to other countries like Canada and across the globe. So that was fantastic. But the plastic is still there. And so how do you grapple with such a pervasive problem? One thing we do is we're trying to figure out exactly what the sources are of the plastic, and we know that a lot of it is coming in from rivers that flow into the Great Lakes, and we also know that a lot of it's coming in as fibers, primarily from laundry. And there's lots of other sources besides that, but those are two very different kinds of sources, and which require two very different kinds of solutions. We're really pleased to be working with a number of partners and through our Adopt a Beach program to help people figure out how they can focus locally on reducing the use of single-use plastics and plastics that find their way into debris across on the ground, and eventually everything on the ground flows into the water. And so what that can look like is actually local policies that prevent the use of certain plastic items. That can also look like facilities, businesses, cities choosing not to use plastic in some of their products. And it can also be what's even most critical is actually paying attention through monitoring of how those plastics are getting into the Great Lakes through rivers and coastlines and the other sources from the ground that are going in. The more information we have about where the plastic is coming from, the better we can craft solutions that can actually prevent it. We're going to be working this year to actually create tools that volunteers can use to figure out how they can address plastic reduction in their communities locally, and we're really excited about that.
Great. Thanks, Joel. I have a question that somebody has sent in about the ballast water and invasive species introductions via ocean-going vessels. The question looks like they're getting at the potential, there's often talk of the potential economic impact of shippers being required to install ballast water treatment technology on board their ships to reduce the potential invasions of invasive species versus the large economic cost of invasive species on the Great Lakes now. So I don't know if Joel or Molly, you could talk about that issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good point that the cost of aquatic invasive species to Great Lakes communities and to the Great Lakes ecosystem is huge. And of course, there is a cost to install technology on ships. However, we know that it's worth it because of the cost to the Great Lakes of new invasions. And in fact, one of the international shipping companies, FedNav, is already installing ballast water treatment technology on its new ships. And so it's demonstrating to shippers around the world that do ship in the Great Lakes that it's possible to install ballast water technology on ships. And we applaud FedNav for being a leader in that. And so I think, there's some expense to any industry when they're asked to stop polluting. But it's important that every industry pay its fair share in protecting the Great Lakes. And what we're asking the shipping industry to do is the same thing that we ask, steel companies and municipalities all around the region to do, is put in technology that cleans up the water before you dump it into the lakes. We know it's possible. FedNav's doing it. We need to see every shipping company do the same.
Great. Thank you so much, Molly. We do have a number of questions that I'll just sort of condense a little bit about where to find other resources, volunteer opportunities. Again, you can find all of that on our website, which is greatlakes.org. And if you click on the Get Involved button, that has a ton of resources for volunteers, educators, and others who want to get a little bit more deeply involved in these issues. And also, I would encourage everyone to join our email list, which is at greatlakes.org/subscribe. And we will certainly keep you all up to date on any new resources that are heading your way. We're here heading close to the top of the hour, so I'll turn it back over to Joel Bremeyer to say a few closing words.
First of all, I'll just say thank you again to all of you who took an hour out of your day to hear more about the Great Lakes, and hopefully each of you will take an action today that will help us and many other supporters around the Great Lakes region protect the Great Lakes. Your voice is needed now. I don't think I need to tell you more than perhaps ever before, and so thank you for taking the time to do that. I think that, Molly's last comments about the ballast water issue really are telling for the entire Great Lakes region. We are an example for the country and for the world that environmental protection is not something that's at odds with the economy. It's not something that's at odds with public health. It's not something that is at odds with opportunities for people. But the Great Lakes, by protecting clean water, we create a strong economy, we create healthy people, and we create opportunities for people to grow in a way around clean water that we think is unique and special. We're really pleased to have you as part of that conversation, and I'll look forward hopefully to talking with some of you personally and hearing about the actions you take after today. So thanks again, and I think with that we're going to close out our conversation.
Great. Thank you so much, Joel and Molly, and thank you so much to everyone who joined us today. Again, we'll be sending a copy of the recording and additional materials to you all via email later on today. Thank you so much again, and have a wonderful afternoon.